Yeah, welcome, Craig and Ian. Just before you got here, it was announced that the session is being recorded. So if anyone has a preference that it's not recorded, please do let Carl know, as in Lean Agile on the label there. She can send via a private message, or you can add it in the chat. It's up to you. Okay, so welcome everybody. As people filter in now, we'll just let them filter in and join us. So I'm gonna probably hit share on my screen because that will help me show you a few slides. And which are over here. And I'm going to try and keep the chat visible. So if anyone does have a question, feedback, thoughts, do feel free to drop it in the chat, especially if I've said something that wasn't clear, or if my audio broke up for a moment or anything like that. Just leave it in the chat and I'm happy to pick it up. If there's anything that was particularly interesting about what I said, if you happen to use Twitter, do feel free to mention it there and tag me. Note that Antony does not have an H, catches people out all the time. They're like, why didn't you get my tweet? I'm like, find out that they spoke to the Anthony Marcano, and that wasn't me, unfortunately. Or if you're on LinkedIn, feel free to do that there as well. Again, you can tag me on LinkedIn. There's some stuff about me there, but that's already in the bio that was sent out, which of course you can't read because at the moment, because our meetup is down. So really what I'm going to do today is kind of I'm going to do like an adapted version of a talk that I gave recently amidst some losing twos going past. Right, yeah, so it's a talk that I gave recently, but I'll kind of do an adapted version, a bit more casual, a bit more chilled. And what I want to really talk about is user stories. And I'm going to do my best to try and re-explain user stories in my own words, because what I've found with a lot of the teams that I worked with and have worked with over the years, and even I found this in myself in the earlier years, back in the sort of very early 2000s, when I first started working with user stories. It kind of freaks me out that it's been 20 years now. But I've noticed that the way in which many of the teams that I work with as a coach, what they call a user story doesn't seem to match up with what I call a user story. And I'm noticing that gap getting wider and wider and wider over time. And I believe that's for a number of reasons. But one of the challenges with that is that it's not that we're necessarily talking about different things. It's just that I think those teams are missing out on actually the value in user stories as a way of working. And through having to try and keep re-explaining and finding different ways of getting the ideas behind user stories across, I've come up with some ways of explaining it that I'm going to share with you today. And I'm going to start with some of the origins of user stories. So in the mid-90s, there was a paper written by Ward Cunningham and called Episodes. It was a pattern language for an approach to software development, or basically a methodology or a framework, whichever you want to call it. And one of the things in that particular paper was this concept of implied requirements. And the idea was that you, as he explained, select and name chunks of functionality. Those names would have a meaning to the customers, consistent with a product initiative. That product initiative would have been explained very clearly, the goals of it, etc. And the idea was that these names would imply the requirement without actually specifying it. And the actual communication of what was needed would happen collaboratively in a conversation. Now, some years later, when he was working with Kent Beck on the Chrysler project, from which many of the ideas that some people today would call agile, but at the time ended up being called extreme programming. One of the things that came out of that was this concept of a user story. Just want to double check that everyone can actually see. I've got these little windows covering bits up. I want to make sure they're not.
Yeah, we can see. Well, I can see.
Good. So in his first book about extreme programming, Kent talked about this idea that the business users would write a story describing something the system needs to do. And with that, a conversation would happen in order to understand what it is they were trying to achieve. And then further on from that, Mike Cohn wrote a book called User Stories Applied. And in fact, in the XP days, it was a customer story. And the term user story came about after many discussions across various user groups that we really need to put the user at the forefront of this, not necessarily the customer. And that's something that I like to get into sometimes, which is there is actually a distinction between the user and the customer. They're not always the same person. The person paying for the product or paying for the work isn't necessarily someone who's directly benefiting from it. And in fact, there's other more complicated relationships, such as, I don't know, for example, at Facebook. If you're using Facebook to share photos, you're not a customer, you're a user. But if you're paying for advertising, then you're a customer and a user. So it kind of gets a bit kind of confused. So the focus about this was really about the user as opposed to the customer. And Mike spoke about it and described it as user stories describe functionality that would be valuable to either a user or purchaser of a system or software, and talked about three aspects of it: a written description, a conversation, and tests that convey and document the details that can be used to determine when the story is complete. Now, all of these different ways of explaining it kind of were a continuous refinement and improvement. And one of my favorites that followed was actually Ron Jeffries, which was the idea that user stories are the card, conversation, and confirmation, which you can kind of see somewhat expressed here, but more clearly in the sense that, you know, what we write on the card doesn't contain all the information. Instead, it's just enough to remind everyone of what the story was. The second part being the conversation. So the actual understanding is communicated via a conversation, an exchange of thoughts, opinions, and feelings, so that the people who have the need and the people who have the ability to meet that need can arrive at a shared understanding. And the confirmation, which is really about trying to make sure that we have a clear way of knowing when that story is done. So defining the scope of it. And back in those days, we called them customer tests, and then they became acceptance tests. And then somehow acceptance criteria came into mix. And that's a bit of a digression, but I think that was something to do with UML terminology coming from use cases that had acceptance criteria, but that's probably a story for another day, or maybe later in this session. Now, one of the things that I noticed in lots of different explanations, whether it was the ones I've just shown you or others that I could probably pluck out off the internet, was uses of common terms like feature, functionality, sometimes task, sometimes work. And I had to take some time to really think about that in the course of me trying to work with teams to help them really see what I could see in terms of what they could achieve with stories. And I actually kind of went back to the basics and just looked up the dictionary definition of these words, because we use them day in, day out, like a task. We use task, we use feature, we use functionality, but what do we really mean by those kinds of words? So I looked up the dictionary definitions, and my paraphrasing and summary of those things in the context of a lot of the work that many of us will do in creating products is that the tasks are what we need to do to implement a feature, which is an attribute of the product that provides functionality, which is the things that the product does And then occasionally people throw the word in requirement, which to me is just an unproven idea that someone important wants us to get done, or something that they believe in particularly. And I thought, well, do any of these things represent for me a user story? And I thought, no, none of them really quite fit. I might perform a task that might result in a feature, that might result in some functionality. But are any of those things really a user story? Do those words go together? And over some time, I was really struggling to make them fit. And I thought that was quite an interesting thing to me, because so many of those words were used in previous explanations. And sometimes were used as a rebuttal to me when I said, well, maybe we could think of it differently. Oh no, but it says in this book, it's functionality. And look, this is how we used to write down functionality before. So what's the difference? And I thought about it, and this came to mind. And I'm sure many of you have seen this before, but for those, if there's anyone who hasn't, there's this idea that the language that we use is both a reflection of our understanding of something, but it also influences the way we think about something or think about the world around us. So I thought, if the way or the language that I use includes things like functionality and features, or even tasks occasionally, is that helping to get the idea of user stories across? And then I came to the conclusion that it wasn't. So I sat down and I thought, let me try and write down in my own words, without using feature, task, or functionality. Let me just try and write down what a user story is to me. I'm going to share that with you. So in my own words, a user story is literally just that. It's a user story told in the terms of something that user wants to achieve sometime in the future, and why. Each story can be independently valuable as an outcome for that user, no matter how small. And what we write down is just enough to remember the user's story. And I say it like that on purpose, because one of the things that I feel gets lost in some of the conversations or even interactions with user stories, especially now where so many of us are working remotely and online and can't have a physical whiteboard anymore and can only work with a tool like Jira or Rally or Trello, is I hear teams say things like, oh, well, there's not enough detail in the story. I said, what do you mean when you say in the story? What do you mean? And they say, look, and they'll open the card. And I'm like, okay, that's the card. Have you had a conversation about it? And often there hasn't been a conversation. It's kind of been handed over, thrown over the wall for someone to then go and work on based on the information in that card or entry or whatever. So I'm like, well, has anyone told you the user story? What's the situation they're in? What's the context? What are they finding difficult? What are they unable to do? What would they like to be able to do? Why is that important to them? And usually people can't answer that question. And I say usually, that's usually with many of the teams that I'm working with where I've been hired in as a coach. And that's probably they're hiring me in as a coach for a reason, because they want the team to understand some of these concepts. So that was my sort of way of trying to articulate a user story. But then I thought, well, how would I explain the term user stories? Is that just many of these? And I thought, well, actually, yes, it is, but it's also something else. To me, it's actually a way of working that, and I think Jeff Patton also explained this in his book, user story mapping, where he talks about this is actually a way of working. It's much more how we interact with each other, and that it's not quite a case of writing things on a card, handing it to someone to implement, and then them handing over the finished product. it's a much more, from the outsider point of view, messy, but on the inside, skillful activity. And this is just a little illustration that I share. This is actually on my Twitter, I think one of the pinned posts at the moment. It's an illustration that I did just to try and get across this idea of the card and the conversation, because in the middle of it all is the conversation. And what we write down on the card, I like the phrase Jeff Patton uses about, is vacation photo levels of information. So it's just enough to remind us of that moment, of that conversation. And that conversation may explore an idea that was summarized on a card, but then go into more depth. And we may use whiteboards and visualizations. We may say, well, how will we know when this is done, and start outlining the scenarios? That might change the conversation, say, well, actually, this seems to be a different thing to what we described. Then we might tear up that card, throw it away, and write a new one. Or in the world of Jira and Rally, just edit the content of the card. And we keep going through this loop, and that might generate new ideas that might go onto a pile or a backlog. And that feeds into another process, which I'm not going to go into today, but how we might then have further conversations that result in us kind of taking each of those more detailed scenarios and actually seeing them become a reality in our product. And that didn't really feel very much like this, which is what I notice in a lot of teams who will show me, we've got a Kanban board. I said, great, show me your Kanban board. What's it helping you do? It visualizes our process, fantastic. And then I see a column for to do, and then I see a column for analysis, and then another one for implement, and then another one for testing, and then another one for release, and then another one for done. And I'm like, that's an interesting process, because it reminds me of another process. And I'm sure you recognize this. This is actually from Dr. Winston Royce's 1970 paper, which later got referred to as the waterfall paper. There's a diagram that doesn't have all of these bits coming off of it. What I thought was interesting about this, though, is that what he explained at the time was that that was how our systems were being produced at the time, but it was essentially flawed. I think the first sentence underneath the first diagram that he had in the paper was, this process is flawed and invites failure. And the reason for that was because of the need, as he explained, for iteration. And back in 1960s and then 1970, of course, when this paper was written about how things were being done in the 60s, computers were very expensive. So iterating in the computer was just, incomprehensible. Computers were way too expensive. Running the software in it was expensive. Changing the software is expensive, but paper was cheap. So we did as much of the iteration on paper as possible. Now, interestingly, even in that paper, he did say, involve the customer throughout and repeat this process twice if possible, which twice back in 1970 seemed, insane. But nonetheless, what we tend to see, whether it's on a card by card basis, or if teams have iterations and iteration by iteration basis, you still see this process. And there's this artifact that's being passed into this process, which seems to have just been replaced the requirements document, almost as if it's just a paragraph from a requirements document. So that just is something that I see a lot, and it feels completely like alien to me, but it kind of isn't that uncommon. Certainly not in my experience, not in the experience of many of the people that I speak with who are out there working with other teams. And apparently so, for the fact that we also have needed this explanation for some time. So I'm stealing this from Henrik Nieberg. I'm sure you've all seen this before, but the way that I tell it is just a tiny, tiny little bit different, in that when I share this particular picture, I sort of talk about this idea that the idea is we want this new product, and it's going to be a car. And we know what parts we need to make a car to make our customer happy. So we plan our way backwards to figure out what parts we need to build. what pieces that we need to create and then integrate to make it into this final product of a car. And then we build them step by step. So let's imagine, though, we were to ask the question, well, what's the problem that you hope to solve with this product? Rather than just say, okay, sure, we'll build that car. What's the problem you're hoping to solve with this product? Well, let's say in this particular case, I'm somebody who lives in the middle of the countryside and there's no public transport. And at the moment, my only way to get to work is by walking. So I need this new product that no one's ever heard of. And someone says, oh yes, what you need is a car. I'm like, okay, great. I said, well, the problem I've got is it takes me 90 minutes to get to work and 90 minutes to get home because it's a long walk. Great. So I spend, let's say each of these is a week. In the first week, I spend 3 hours a day, 5 days a week walking. In week 2, I spend 3 hours a day, 5 days a week walking. And again, the same again in week 3. And then in week 4, I get my car and I am happy. And especially if anyone knows anything about me, I'm especially happy because I am an absolute car nut. Love everything about cars. However, if you were to ask me what my problem was and then say, well, how could I solve that problem? And I said, well, my problem is I'm spending 3 hours a day walking, 90 minutes to and from work each way. Well, maybe we can shorten that journey for you. Maybe we can save you 20 minutes each way with a skateboard. Let's just assume I've got the skateboarding skills. All right, well, we'll iterate on that though, because in the first week I said I was a little bit tired from that. Or maybe we can give you some handlebars to stabilize yourself so you're not so tired. I'm like, great, thank you. So yep, end of week 2, my journey has still been saved to 20 minutes. It's a little less tiring, but now I have this next evolution of the product, which is in this form of this bicycle. So now this bicycle shortens my commute down to 45 minutes each way. So now I'm spending only 90 minutes. Now I've got 90 minutes back. Now I can actually then top up some of my cycling with some weights because I've got some time to do some weights at home. I have a more balanced exercise program and maybe spend a bit more time with my family. But now I want to spend even more time with my family. So the next evolution is this motorized bicycle or a motorcycle. Now that gets my journey time down to, let's say, 25 minutes each way. So now my journey time is dramatically reduced. Each step of the way, I've saved more and more time and been able to use that time more productively elsewhere. And then, of course, in week 5, I get my car, the product that we all thought was going to be the solution to my problems. And these were just compromises along the way, only to find that it takes me 90 minutes to get to work each day because I'm stuck in traffic. Now, in the old way, we'd have to go back to the drawing board and start all over again. And then I might have to wait another 4 weeks before I actually get the product I really need. But in this case, as a digital product is, we can just go back to what I had before. We just revert. So to me, this is the real value of user stories, is that if I tell you my story, that I'm a commuter, but I have no transportation and I have to walk every day. And that's taking up all of my time that I'd like to spend with my family. And while walking is great exercise, I'd like to have a more balanced exercise program. So I'd like to get some of that time back in order to be able to use it more productively. That's going to encourage that conversation. But if I ask for a car because I think I need a car and you give me a car, and the only way to get to that car is along this process, then, well, obviously I'm going to miss out. And despite many teams saying that they're doing this, I still see them doing this, building the components of the product until eventually, after several stories later, they have the feature that they had in mind. Whereas in this case, the feature that people may have had in mind wasn't the feature I actually needed, but we had to have experience of solving the actual problem I was trying to solve before we realized that. And I think this is like such a powerful image, and I really sort of thank Emric for having created it, because it provides such a brilliant way of explaining the intent. And I use some other analogies along the lines of exercises around, what are the stories for creating a house? And often people start writing down a roof, windows, walls, doors, etc. And one of the things I always say to them is, okay, you want a roof. What problem would that solve for you? Or what would that do? What would the functionality of a roof be? What does the roof feature of the house product do? Oh, well, it keeps you dry. Okay, so what problem does that solve for me? What do I get to do? And say, well, then you get to stay dry. All right, so I get to stay dry. Great. So are there any other ways of solving the problem of keeping dry? Well, actually, yeah, we could give you an umbrella. In fact, we can give you an umbrella now. Brilliant. And in fact, you know what? That'll do for now, because my other problem of, getting my car off the road to save my insurance is more important to me than any of the other things that I need right now. So maybe we can solve that problem first. That's what user stories is meant to be about. It's meant to be about understanding my situation as a user and the situation I'm in. I was working with a streaming provider, video streaming service, and one of the cool things, this was a while ago, one of the cool things having worked with them was I saw them kind of capture this idea of a user story so perfectly in their demo of a new capability they put in their product. The new capability was originally expressed in terms of, we want a car, or in their case, we want cross-platform resume. And I said to them, well, what does that cross-platform resume mean? And they were like, well, if you start watching on your laptop, you carry on watching the same program from where you left off on your phone. I was like, okay, that sounds pretty cool. Why would I want to do that? Like, well, because it's a bit of a hassle, isn't it? If you start watching something, I don't know, at home over your breakfast, your favorite show from last night, you run out of time. Now you've got to go to the bus stop, you get on the bus, you've got to take out your phone. Maybe you're only on the bus for 20 minutes. You don't want to have to then search for the show, then remember where you were, and then scrub along to try and find where you were in the show, and then get to start watching it a few minutes later. You want to just open your phone, open the app, and it just asks you straight away, do you want to carry on watching? I'm like, exactly. That's the story right there. So and they were fantastic with the data that they collected. I said, well, what's the most common transition between devices? Do you have enough data on that? And they said, you know what, we probably do. So they went away, and a day and a half later, they came back and they said, yeah, most often the transition is from a browser on their desktop to an iOS device, usually an iPhone. And I went, great. Who is that person? And then they told me, oh, well, it's Steve, and he's having his cornflakes in the morning, and he's watching name of show from last night, which I can't say because then I'm revealing who it is. And then he runs out of time. He gets on the bus. He's squished on the bus because he's standing downstairs, and he's got his iPhone out, and he's watching the show. Fantastic. That's the story. And historically, what they would have done is they said, right, we want this cross-platform resume, and they would have implemented everything that you would need in the infrastructure to send and receive where you were, in what show you were watching, where you were in the show, to a centralized location, and then gone through all of the devices to add the capability to send and receive in each device. I said, well, all we need to do for this story is figure out how we can tell the browser to send where the person is in the show, and how we can get the iPhone to receive where they are in the show. They don't need to do anything else. And they're like, yeah, but they will do. I said, yeah, but they don't need to yet. You just told me that's like 45% of your users make that transition. You can give value to 45% of your users in half the time. They were like, okay, good point, let's try it. And they did, and it worked. But it was literally a story. But unfortunately, we do kind of like to grab hold of certain things like templates. And this was a fantastic template. It was a great way of expressing the beginning of that conversation. But unfortunately, people then kind of just thought, well, I can just put whatever I want into this template. They cross out the word to from the template. That was a key part. So I want to do something was key to the template, but people crossed that out and said, oh, I want some task to be done, or I want some requirement, or I want some feature. And the feature on the car is the windscreen, or the feature on the house is the roof. But on their own, they're not particularly useful. And usually you can't have those things until you've got several other things together. Whereas if I know the problem that the user has and why it's important to them, I have a much better chance of coming up with a much simpler, more innovative way of solving their problem. You know, you'd see stories like this. I'm guilty of this. I did this back in the day. I didn't get it. So I have learned the hard way. And what we have is this idea of, many teams have become template zombies. Well, they'll take pretty much anything and stuff it into as a I want so that, and it becomes a user story. Or they'll put it into Rally, and because Rally labels the entry a user story, it's a user story. And it kind of made me think about a little story from a while back, where if anyone's seen this film, The Net, or you've probably seen films like it, I don't know, Jurassic Park comes to mind. You'll see things like this, and this is meant to be an IP. These are meant to be IP addresses, or it's meant to be an IP address. And I'm going to throw it out there actually real quick for anyone who could throw this into the chat. If you can tell me why it's not an IP address. Yep, 100%. Yep, that's exactly why. So the largest number you can have in a v4 IP address is 255. And this has got 345 in it. But to the untrained eye, it's 4 numbers separated by 3 dots. It's an IP address. But if you know about IP addresses, then you know that it's not. And I have a similar experience with a lot of stories that I see written down for that reason, where I see things like this and I know that it's not a story. But when I start to see something like this, I start to think, oh, that's interesting. This is about someone wanting to know something and why they want to know it. Tell me this story. And then I can ask, tell me about Callie the cashier. You know, why do they want to know the correct change? Oh, well, what's the situation they're in? Why aren't they being told the correct change already? Well, the EPOS system doesn't do that yet. Okay, fair enough. But this could also be a representation of a story. And this can be a representation of the story, because they're all just a card. They're not the story. And what we write down here, what we write down in Jira, in Rally, in Trello, it's not the story. It's just the card. It's just the starting point of the conversation, the invitation to the conversation, as some people will call it. So the card is not the story. And this is something I really try to get across to teams a lot. So when I'm working with a team, I'll even find myself saying, oh, tell me more about that story card, because I want to keep re-emphasizing this idea that that's not the story. It's just the card. Not to be pedantic about it, but again, going back to this idea that the language we use helps change the way we think about things. You know, I would prefer to try and encourage them to start also thinking about that as just the card, not as the actual story. And I mentioned this quotation before, that really the information in there is very high level, just like a holiday photo. We look at that photo and there's a whole story about what happened in the moments in the run up to that moment and what happened afterwards. And that one picture just reminds us of all of that detail. And I think that's what the card is there to be. It's just to remind us of the idea or the conversation we had about that idea, or the conversations that we have about the idea, because it's not necessarily just one conversation. And the analogy that I like to use for this is from René Magritte's image, where he showed a pipe and said, this is not a pipe. And apparently he got a really hard time for it, because people said it is a pipe. And he's like, it's not a pipe. It's just a picture. It's just a representation. And that's how I feel about the story card. And it's become a thing for me, because I've seen so many teams spend so much time worrying about what they're writing in the card that they forget to have the conversation. Now, when it starts to become useful, I think, is when you're using what you write in the card to inspire a conversation, to drive the conversation, to test if you've got the same shared understanding. Because if you can write down in simple words a summary of what you've all just explained, and it feels right and it makes sense to everybody, that becomes a useful tool to help in that conversation. But nonetheless, I really do believe that it is about stories that are told, as Ron has pointed out. So when I take the phrase user stories, and I think, well, how would I explain that? I would explain user stories as a way of working that through conversation helps teams and users come to a shared understanding of the problems users need solved and why it matters to them. And it lets the discovery of the best solution happen during the implementation with small valuable evolutions to the product, both incrementally and iteratively. And those increments and iterations happen within the story, one scenario at a time, and in the product, one story at a time. And even in the user's understanding of the problem that they need solved, because sometimes the problem they think they have turns out not to be the one that matters most, but they don't know that until they see the result of what they've asked for. So the conversations really are how we understand the user story. And just to sort of round this off a little bit, there's a framework that I use. Sorry for the sketchy notes on here, but this is literally something that I found and I wrote notes all over it. And it's from a concept called results-based management. And this came from the UN as a way to think about project and program management that didn't have this idea of like maybe monetary benefit. For them, they were interested in impact. It could be reducing the mortality rates in children in a particular region of the world, for example. And the outcomes may be that people can access fresh drinking water, clean drinking water within 2 miles of their home. Or the outputs that they've dug 5 wells within a particular region, or there are 5 wells within a certain radius in a particular region. And the process, the activities were that they had to dig those wells and reinforce them and build them. And the inputs were the resources, the materials, and the people and the skills required to make those activities happen. And I like this framework. It's slightly different if you've heard of something called impact mapping from Gojko Adzik. It's slightly different, and I spoke to him about this. His impact is more an outcome in this framework. But I found this really, really useful as a way of thinking about what is it that we are looking at a lot of the time. A lot of the time, people talk in terms of features, and really they're just outputs of our work. The outcome is, what's going to change for that user? What will they be able to do differently? How will something they couldn't do be now possible? For example, here, people having access to drinking water within a 2-mile radius is an outcome for those users, for those people. And similarly, the ability to to be able to watch, pick up from where you left off in a show on a different device with ease is the outcome from another user. So I suppose in summary, what a story isn't, it's not a task that we do. It's not something that we do to implement something. It's not a feature or an attribute the product has. It's not functionality, i.e. the things that the product does. And it's very rarely, well, often can be a requirement, an unproven idea that someone important wants, but that's fine. If it's something that they want to try and we can create that quickly and learn from it quickly with rapid learning, then that actually makes that idea, the concept of that, okay. Because we're not building an entire huge thing, we're solving a tiny little problem one step at a time. So yeah, to me, a story is actually literally a user's story. I want to know what's your current situation? What's your current day like? What are you trying to do, and how does it feel difficult to you? What is it that you can't do or you want to be able to do? These are the things that I want to know. And I don't think of user stories as just a collection of things that we call a user story, but it's a whole way of working. And it's a skill, and one that's deceptively simple on the surface if we define it in terms of a template, but actually quite subtle and intricate in many ways. So that's my attempt at re-explaining user stories, moving away from the common terminology of features, functionality, requirements, and tasks, but really just focusing on what, for me, I think that's what it was really all about. And with the people I've worked with over the years, like Rachel Davies and Ivan Moore, who were on the original Connextra team, who came up with the "as I want to say that," which many of them I just say, well, I don't really want anything to do with that anymore. Through to people like Kent Beck, and I've been in sessions with Mike Cohn. I feel like we all kind of have the same rough understanding of it. It's just that over the years, perhaps we were using language that came from, for us, a more recent past. But the more distant that past has got for me, the less relevant those terms have become. And now I think I'd like to really just focus on just understanding the user's story. So that's my talk for today. Thank you for listening. And I welcome any questions and challenges or even objections.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So yeah, jump in, take yourself off mute, and let us know what questions or challenges you have.
I'll go. It's not a question or a challenge, really, just more kind of carrying on the discussion. So one of the things for me that I often find is, I mean, everything you've said in there is absolutely brilliant, fantastic, and we all would love to be having those discussions from the point of view of the user's needs that need to be met. In practice, the difficulties I often see is people changing that kind of muscle memory to, they've got a way of they've learned how to write user stories by just dumping stuff into a Jira ticket or a Rally ticket. And then you come along and try and convince them to even use a basic format as I want so that. And they struggle to make that flip. And each time they start a new user story, it's just, just a brain dump again. And then, like if you do get to the point where they have started to use the user story format, and you want to move them on to something that's a bit more like, just conversational, like you're saying here, or based on their actual need of a user, then that's another, kind of change they need to assimilate and kind of take on board. Sometimes it takes a long time for that to happen, to kind of make those changes.
Yeah.
That's something you've experienced?
Every day. Every day. Even more so, I have an experience I had where I was working with a group over a very long period of time. And I worked with an original team, got them to a really good point. And they thought, oh, right, we want to start cycling people through the organization, spread some of this knowledge, and cycled people in, and just cycled too many people in too quickly and regressed the entire team. I literally had to start from scratch. And it was like, every few months it was like Groundhog Day. And I was like, you really need to just slow down and just recycle people through these teams a little bit more slowly. Yeah, I have it all the time. I'd say, first of all, I don't encourage people to write the card in that format. I don't discourage it, but I don't encourage it. I like to always start from wherever people are, because if I'm there, they're already successful, because they won't be paying for someone external if they're not successful enough to have some spare cash to pay for someone to come in and help them get better at something. And I want to make sure that that team retains whatever has made them successful. Maybe that's a brain dump, but that's still a good place to start. And it might be that that one card could actually represent many, many, many different user stories. So I would really just want to sit down and start with the conversation, forget the format of the card, and just have the conversation. And just see if I can get the person to articulate that in some visual way, or talk me through some examples. Say, can you give me an example of what would happen in regards to this? And people can more easily then start to give you examples of what would happen. And then you start to see where some of those examples might actually be just a single scenario that could use as a acceptance criteria or acceptance test. And sometimes that single scenario actually is not a single scenario, it's many variations within it, and that's a whole new story. So I'd really try to, as much as possible, to start with a conversation and steer away from the sort of pseudo methodology elements of it. That's the way I try to handle that now.
It sounds like you're very patient.
Well, I think,
or maybe I'm impatient.
Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't always been, but I learned a lot from two experiences. One of them was being a dad, and my son's 21 now, so he's been through all the teenage years. So trust me, that needs a lot of patience if you haven't been through that. And also, my son was a racing driver for a while. And at first, he wasn't a racing driver, just with a dream. But then he's kind of really committed himself to it and started to make it happen. And one of the things I thought about as well, I can't afford to pay a professional coach. So I'm going to have to try and reach into my coaching skills to figure out how can I help him find ways to improve using everything I know about how do you improve. And because I'm not a racing driver, I know a bit about driving, but I'm not a racing driver. It's a completely different discipline to driving on the road. I knew that I couldn't give him any advice or instruction. All I could do is help him figure out for himself how he could make things better, one small step at a time. And what I took away from that particular experience is actually that feels slower, but it is way faster as a way of improving, because one of two things happens when we try to get people to work in a different way by showing them how to work in that way and then say, right, I've shown you, now copy me, is they'll either try to copy you but only have a superficial understanding, or they'll try to make it look like they're copying you but really carry on doing things the way they always did them. And then you spend more time trying to figure out how to get them to stop doing that, and instead just try to find out, well, what is it? Retrospectives is where I like to start if I can, because I like to know, well, what does the team feel is getting in their way? And then I start to edge in with questions like, okay, how could we measure whether that's getting better or not? And then, let the team do the rest, and they will, even if they start from complete waterfall, you drop in that as a regular process, they will reinvent Agile. I've actually done it twice now, where the team pretty much reinvented a lot of the practices, and then started to say, hang on, this looks a lot like user stories, doesn't it? Because I read about that and I'm like, yeah, it does, doesn't it? It's funny that, isn't it? Oh, how this looks a little bit like TDD. Yeah, it does a bit, and it's because they were just trying to solve problems. And that's how XP came about. That's how Agile processes came about. It came about because people asked the question, well, how could we find ways of improving and doing things better? And then as people did that, they shared what they learned, and then people took on board those ideas and built upon them. And now look, we're all shipping stuff to production within minutes of committing and pushing code into a master branch, which is only 15 minutes since we've just did it previously. And who would have thought that 20 years ago? I mean, one or two places in the world were doing something close to that, but literally now that is just de facto, isn't it? And I think that's the key. I think you get to that point, improvement's like an exponential thing. Like you see like, or an S-curve realistically. You know, you see nothing, and then when they start to see for themselves, then you see a rapid improvement, and then when they're really good, that's when you see only marginal gains. And that's when, as a coach, I know, okay, now I can step away.
Okay. Any more questions, comments, thoughts?
Is there anything that you were surprised about in what I've said today?
I think for me, if I may, it was really, really useful because it's all, a lot of the stuff is things that I've known, I've read a lot, but it was a really good refresher and a reminder, because I think, I'm sure everyone is, but I'm guilty as well, day to day, of overlooking things that I really should know. So it was really useful just to have a recap of a lot of things, and you've put some really good things into perspective for me. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Was there anything that was in the metaphors that didn't make sense, or would have made sense if there was a different metaphor? And do you have that metaphor? Do you have a different metaphor that you would use? So I used the pipe that is not a pipe. I used the IP address for the templates. Are we building the features of the product and then the end product we have in mind, or are we solving a problem and allowing ourselves to discover the products we really need using Henrik Nieberg's image? Does anyone else have any different stories?
I don't necessarily have a story around that, if you don't mind me jumping to a slightly different angle. I think, I mean, it's a fantastic presentation. I'm totally on board with the ideas that you've talked about. In my current situation, and this may reveal some organizational challenges that I have, that we have a product owner who will bring these stories in the format that you've talked about, like is a fairly common approach at the moment. And I might say to him, okay, attended this great meetup, it's actually all about the story. We need to kind of reflect on the user and what the user is trying to do and all of the things that you talked about. And I have a feeling he might not be able to tell me the story himself, because the story has really been passed down to him from some other part of the organization, or for some kind of leader or person that speaks the loudest. I mean, how do you deal with that challenge? Is that something you've encountered?
Oh yeah, all the time. I mean, especially like a lot of organizations are still organized around components of a system rather than vertically integrated sub-products. And that can make it hard. One of the teams I'm working with and have been for some time, kind of stuck in that place where, you know, the leadership of the organization wants to move towards what they're calling product teams. They still haven't fully really understood what that meant. And they're still evolving from a misunderstanding of a product being a component to actually a product being something that somebody somewhere gets some value from. And this particular team is looking after some quite important layer of microservices that has been created from nothing over the last couple of years to provide some quite critical capability to the organization, especially now, because it's made it possible for them to sell things in ways that they've never sold them before, which was essential during this time. But nonetheless, they are a layer of services that are providing APIs to another team that's building another layer of something, which is serving services to another team, which finally gets to a UI that finally gets to an actual customer or end user. So, you know, what the approach I took with that was to say, okay, let's not stress too much about these things that we can't change. The organization's too big, we can't change it. We can influence it, but we have to influence it by example. So let's just put that to one side and think, who is our user? And, you know, oh, well, it's the middle tier. No, it's not the middle tier. Who is our user? It's a person. Oh, well, it's insert name of system here. I'm like, no, it's a person. And they were like, well, I guess it's the developer. Yeah, it's the developer of the other system that has to write their code that integrates with our APIs. So how does that change the way we understand the problem we're solving? And suddenly, stuff that was where they had to build an entire service became, I want to know how to integrate with insert name of service here. You just wanted to know how to. Now I don't need to build a whole service. I just need some little stub with some Swagger documentation that responds with some canned data. I can show you the documentation. I can show you the object structures. You can give me feedback. Oh no, I don't like that bit in there. Can we move that out to its own part of the model? Sure, we can. No problem. Do that quickly. Suddenly, it's a different thing. So by treating the user of the other system, who we could speak to, the developer of the other system that has to integrate with these APIs as the user, suddenly we could find ways of slicing the work up into these tiny, tiny, tiny little user stories, because we could then say to them, and why did you want that bit of information? Oh, well, that's so that we know whether we can sell this one or that one in that particular market. Great, fantastic. Right, well, do you know what? We've actually got another way of solving that. And it's over here. Oh, what? We don't need a new service? No, we've already got one. This is the kind of thing you want to, the situation you want to create. So we try to create that as much of a positive experience around that in our little bubble. And then we started to move out, and I've been working with this group for 3 years, roughly, all in. And we started to move some of those conversations out. And now we are starting to at least do, and well, last year I'd say, doing collaborative story mapping exercises, where we're understanding what is the user's overall high-level journey, who are the other users involved in this process, and what kinds of things they need to be able to do to just achieve this simple business goal. Right, now we understand that, we've got a kind of map that we can all refer to, and we can all understand how our pieces contribute to each of those different pieces of the puzzle. And they're able to ship stuff like all day, every day now. And the main limiting factor is one of the other teams that's still safe and only releases every 3 months, but they'll get there in the end.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the situation that we have is slightly different in that we're kind of an entry point to a number of different business units and some kind of services that are run by other business units. So the details of the user journey we have in our team, but they're very shallow. The knowledge is very shallow. If we start to ask more questions about it, then we'll always hit up against these kind of organizational boundaries. But the point you made about they're literally getting everyone, I mean, in my mind, what we should have done from the very beginning is have this business unit and our team in together and form that story map, and then start to break it down to see the little bits and where we play our part, basically. But okay, cool.
It took time. It took a good 18 months to get to the point where we even got to try that.
Yeah.
You know, and a big part of that was just because we did it in our team, and we created this little bubble where we interacted with this other team in this different way. And then when they came to visit us, they said, what's that? Oh, well, this is our story map. Oh, look, you can see how everything you said to us about the end user's journey is up here. The stuff that you're talking about, you're trying to achieve, is in the middle here. And we hang all of our stuff underneath this. And when the business says, oh, we want to be able to sell this type of product in that type of market, we create a slice for that. And we figure out what are the little things that we need to do to help you do that for your user, for the end user. And they're like, that's really useful. Oh, cool. Yeah, we found it useful as well. And then we started having conversations about it. So it's just, you know, and then those maps started happening by working with them in a collaborative session. And then bit by bit, it started to expand out as other people started to see it. So again, organizational change, just, it takes time.
Yeah.
And you know, my experience as I took away from with my son, where I watched other parents with their young drivers, was they were trying to tell the young drivers what to do and how to do it, and they didn't get it because they didn't know why they were doing it, and they would try to push them to learn how to copy that other driver faster, and all that would just happen, they just end up in this loop of just not getting anywhere. And at first, they may pick up one thing and move forward a bit more quickly, but slow and steady wins the race, literally. And I think it's the same with, especially with change, because you're trying to not just change. You're not just trying to create an opportunity for change in the minds of one person. You're trying to change it in a group of people, and that is complicated on its own. Then you're talking about a bigger network of people in a much larger organization. You can't. It can take years just to change one team to where they're doing what this team that I'm working with now are doing, and that's only with a small group of what was a small group of 8 people. What they're doing is they're using a model that I helped them with to expand the team, following these practices, and then get to an uncomfortable size, and then split the team, and then divide the product into 2, and then continue that process of expanding the team as they get investment, and then split the teams, and then divide the product again vertically around those teams. So you maintain the process. So now they're more like 20 people, but as of next week, they're going to be 3 teams. So
cool. Okay, thank you.
I'm mindful of the time. I'm happy to stick around and just chat for anyone else who wants to, but I don't want anyone to feel like they have to stay if they have other things to be doing right now.
Yeah, I was going to suggest maybe one more question. Kind of keep going for another 5 minutes, and then probably we'll all be hitting a bit of Zoom fatigue.
I was just going to say thanks for sharing, and I love the phrase "the user's story."
Can't really hear you, Stephen, or I can't.
He said that it was saying that he liked the phrase "the user's story." It's funny. It's like it's funny how like words can lose their meaning. I don't know. I'm trying to think of another example. Maybe you can help me. But I see people saying, "Oh yeah, it's a user story," and it's like, okay, but it's clearly a task. It's clearly, even if they've used the template as a developer, I want to integrate to the new Hadoop instance, and I'm like, you could literally call it anything. You could just just show people a list to say, this is my list of iPads, and it could have as much meaning as the word user story. But that's why I like to really emphasize this user's story, because it literally is, tell me a story about a user's experience, a user's life, what they're doing, why they're doing it, how they got there. I want to know everything.
Yeah. Is this any better for hearing, by the way?
Very much.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm working with those component teams that you described that other people are working with as well. And I'm just going to say, what I'm going to go back in is to help people look for the user's story. It might not be in the work item that's called the user story, but if we look upwards, because that's what we've all been working towards, we should find the user's story. And it's just going to be a nice little piece of vocabulary to use.
Nice. So I'm glad you took that way. It's good to know that that's useful. I use it a lot. It's going back to that point about the sort of Sapir-Whorf. If we kind of change things up a little bit and use terms like that, someone might even say to you, why do you keep saying user's story? It's a user story. Yeah, what do you think that means? It's literally a user story. Who is the user in this particular case? And then, you can start unraveling this word. Sometimes I would like to almost just create a completely new name that, I don't know, has next to no meaning, and just say it's a new methodology, and just, but it just happens to be user stories. Although, to be fair, that's already been done several times over, I think, with user stories. I've seen quite a few out there that said user stories are terrible. Here, let me show you this completely new way of doing things, which looks exactly like user stories as explained in the book, but we've given it a different name and we've changed the order of the template. But chat for another day.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Anthony.
Thank you.
And I'll so we'll stop the recording.